Hi, everyone. So it is, as an analyst, I have a good time looking at different trends that happen around the market. And I would say that a year ago, I was actually getting a little bored because a lot of the patterns were kind of well known enough that they were not interesting for those of us who like to see change. And then the people who are involved with it say, what do you mean it's stable? It is stable. Cloud has been around for about, AWS, Salesforce has been around since the late 90s, and AWS was in, 12 years ago, was in beta with its storage and, compute. And so pretty much we were on a trajectory that people were moving from legacy systems or a data center-based approach to cloud. And, in maybe 2016, people were sort of not struggling so much to think about being afraid of the cloud because of security issues, but now we're shifting their thinking to embracing the cloud because it improved their security posture. So all those things were happening, and so the momentum was straight line in a way, or very predictable. And then, all of a sudden, Kubernetes caught on. And so all of a sudden we started thinking about portability. Like, oh my God, you don't have to just be in one cloud. You can be across clouds. You don't have to be in any public cloud. You can sort of create a fast private cloud in your data center or hosted, or you can be at the edge with portable assets that have a cloud architecture. And that changed. That has significantly changed vendor behavior and customer adoption. So it was a significant thing. And then there are other trends that also started gaining traction and became more interesting, and we'll cover some of that. So when I say cloud was a predictable trajectory, it's because in 2016, cloud went mainstream. And so by the end of 2016, we do a survey every year around the world about cloud adoption and cloud topics. And in the survey that was fielded in January 2017, more than half of the respondents were either running workloads actively in the cloud or were about ready to deploy workloads in the cloud. So it was now a mainstream topic. And so as a result, I don't have my slides in front, so I have to keep looking at my slides, so I apologize. So as a result, when things go mainstream, it just becomes a default motion. And we saw that a lot in in 2017. I had a lot of inquiry from clients, and I worked on projects with clients who for the first time were bringing big systems over to the cloud. And it's the first time the team actually built anything in the cloud. And a lot of it was driven by the idea that it was now mainstream and mature enough where they could do it or they were being forced to do it. So that this next generation, we're gonna start seeing different behaviors for how you're moving really important critical workloads rather than experimental workloads into the cloud for how you're building custom applications and systems. The other thing that happened, that slide I forgot to adjust, but this is a relevant one. The other thing that was major that happened last year, by the end of 2016, is that the posture for how enterprises sort of mandated cloud also changed, and there was a significant growth from cloud also to cloud first, and now that's the dominant posture. So almost half of people enterprises in the cloud have a cloud, they're operating off of a cloud first mandate, which is driving adoption. And then cloud also is important. And so every single bar that's in there moved up one. And especially cloud also to cloud first was the biggest growth. The other thing that's interesting is that we think because SaaS has been around for a long time, that new projects running on SaaS would dominate, but it's new projects across all layers is important. And also, cloud-first posture applied for replatforming. So if you have existing capabilities and you wanted to move it to cloud rather than taking it and moving it and hosting it on the cloud, that there's the cloud-first posture on replatforming that technology and then deploying it in the cloud. So that was a major trend. And that, both of the first trend and the second trend are going to inform significant changes in how vendors treat enterprises in the cloud, and how vendors deploy different assets that support cloud and not cloud. And so we'll see a lot of change as big and important move to cloud in a significant way. And this goes in, we have been surveying how data centers are changing. And I would say a couple years ago when I was in a meeting, for me, I cover middleware. I'm definitely help people figure out how to purchase and use software to build custom applications and integrate them. So if I'm accidentally in a meeting with data center analysts, it's purely accidental, right, or some weird reason. But a couple of years ago when I was in those meetings, whether it was storage or data center or whatever, they kept recommending to clients that it's cheaper to build on OpenStack or build your own private cloud than to go public, and it wasn't mature yet, mature enough. And then all of a sudden, this is their forecast for how the cloud is, how data centers are moving over the next 5 years. And so you look at compute, right? And you'll see that most of the compute that we all know and are used to has shifted. And so to the point where containers will be the mainstream and most important compute option. And that they're also saying, boldly, 80% of data centers are going to run in cloud. And for that, they're mostly talking about public cloud. So they've decided it's just going to be easier with the patterns that are unfolding to assume that you're going to move to a public cloud. So that was, again, another significant impact. So now let's talk a little bit about what developers, some of the projects and trends that are going on. And again, we'll go back to data, that same CloudView survey. This was 2017. The new survey is just in, and we haven't parsed it yet, so I have to use last year's numbers. So first off, last year, when we asked people how they were going to spend their IT budget, IT cloud budget, or cloud budget, not even IT, they basically said that they're going to be spending more on custom solutions or bespoke than adopting SaaS applications. So that, again, is a major shift. And they're also diversifying or thinking about this in different ways. So on the one hand, if they're going to do bespoke, they're interested in private PaaS. They're also interested in building locally and then hosting on infrastructure as a service. And then they're also, doing things like using the PaaS capabilities of a cloud platform to work. So anyway, so there's a diversity of choices that organizations have right now and plan to spend on. So what I want to do is just talk through some of the trends in each of those categories, because what developers work on are different depending on what the trend is, like where the adoption is going to be. So on SaaS, developers are heavily involved with implementing SaaS. And they work on data issues, like the data team, the developer team, everyone. They're working on, migrating existing making sure that existing capabilities successfully migrate to the new platform. They're looking at integration and connectivity because I don't think there are any enterprise applications that don't need to connect to something other than a database. They're also extending to plug-in functionality gaps. So for example, a really common thing is not to customize the SaaS application. No, that's bad. And what they're doing is extending it by using things like workflow or orchestration tooling to be able to plug in functionality gaps by extending rather than, reconfiguring, because it's not necessarily easy to do anyway if you're in a SaaS environment. It's frowned upon to think that you're going to customize what's deployed, multi-tenanted off of unified code. And and then the other thing that now is happening is that there's more stuff that's showing up that's AI-based. So trying to implement AI-based solutions, or like a lot of the SaaS vendors are offering algorithms and different logic that are applied, as part of the SaaS offering, and how you want to use those becomes somewhat optional, and how you're extending them. So AI is becoming a bigger picture when you're thinking about that. And then you're also, the one that I think is the most interesting is there's a big move by the SaaS vendors as well as by enterprises to extend workflows across clouds. So we started seeing that with iPaaS and connectivity between Salesforce and SAP, for example. But now what's happening is that you'll see like these ecosystems of vendors working together, and the decision was made to expose tasks in each of the originating applications and manage the workflow in the background. So for example, one example is if you need to do an approval-centric workflow, which is common, you could use Salesforce in combination with Box, in combination with, I forgot what the third party, there's a troika that's doing this a lot, but there are specific manual tasks that need to be formed for doing that. So the UI for doing the task in Box is in Box, and the UI that you need for approval-centric workflow for Salesforce is in Salesforce as a task, and then third party. So you're working with inside your core applications, but under the covers is orchestration to make sure that the process works as a unit of one rather than three separate applications doing it themselves. So that puts more interesting pressure, I guess, on development and integration teams to understand what those orchestration flows need to be and how to surface the tasks using SAS capabilities. So when you're also in PaaS, you're in low code. SaaS. The PaaS platforms of application clouds are all low code. So you're basically learning how to configure and model those sorts of things. And there's a lot of embedded features that increase speed. So you lose a little bit of control that you're probably used to when you're developing with code, but they're very highly optimized environments to get the work done, to get SaaS implemented and extended fairly quickly. When you look at PaaS, so one thing, most people when they think about PaaS, they think that it's all just coders doing code or developers doing development. But that's actually less spending is on that than using commercial PaaS software. So for example, how many of you have tried out AWS Lambda? Good, okay. So that's commercial. That's a commercial service of AWS. How many, by the way, since you raised your hands, how many are using step function with that? Oh, okay. That's also interesting. I'm trying to size the difference between the two, so you help me right now. And there's also, almost every class of software that you use to build and integrate applications has a commercial cloud equivalent that lives in the PaaS tier. So companies that are adopting tend to mix and match custom work with using commercial software to better manage it and be a little bit more productive. And then the other thing that I want to talk about with this is that when you work with, for organizations that are trying to move a really important workload to the cloud, it's almost always sponsored. At least in the bespoke area, it's almost always sponsored by business, and it's always urgent. It always has to be done yesterday. And it happens quickly. It's not like a slow rolling decision. It's like, okay, here's a budget, do it. And then they have a timeline. And so developers use that. It's exciting, at least the developer teams I talk to, they get excited by this. They finally get to do something cool in the cloud. And then the business people are focusing on managing the risk of it because they need to get it done quickly because it's important workload. And so there's like a dissension, like the developers want to work with great tools that they haven't gotten to use before, and developers or business are very conservative, and they just want to use tried and true things that can meet their service levels. And so I see this tension all the time. And when I have to get involved with it, I usually default to commercial software too, because it's tried, true, and works. So for any of you who are in a situation where you know that you haven't quite gotten into cloud yet, or you know it's going to happen, then it's important to figure out the services that are interesting for you to do, like Lambda, or Step Function, or iPaaS, or whatever. Just things that scare business people. Make them work in a proof of concept type of thing to make sure that when they're ready to move, they know that they can trust you to build it. The other thing that businesses also are concerned with, like developers talk a lot about vendor lock-in as a great evil, which it can be, or maybe not. But business people talk about developer lock-in. So if you build a custom solution entirely in code, or and no one but that development team knows how to use it, then when they leave, which they will, because they built something cool, so their market value just went up. And then the enterprise is stuck with the code that was built on a custom basis, and then they have to go back and re-platform that. And I've seen a lot of those projects over the past year. So the thing about it is that developer lock-in is a scarier concept for business people, and less scary than vendor lock-in. So, looking at a cloud and understanding what assets are available that can help you get the job done are really important, because it makes it safer for business and tech developers. And the other issue that's happening, there's a lot of digital enthusiasts out there, and they've been given a lot of freedom or independence to build what they want where they want, and or experiment where they want, maybe. And what's happening is that they pick different clouds. Like some people will pick Amazon, some people will pick Azure, some will pick Google, and they use the native API management capability or API gateways. They build microservices with REST APIs, and they manage them in an API gateway. Perfect behavior. But they're not the same gateway. So then you have this new sprawl that's happening right now around being able to access high-value APIs that were created across diverse locations. And so that's something that that's been a denser area of inquiry for me over the past year. And it's because you have to at some point be able to make valuable assets available across the organization on a self-service basis. So if no one can find them and they can't connect, then what's the point, right? And so when you think, as you move into cloud, then there's going to have to be some motion about thinking about how to organize it better, or to use tooling that's capable of recognizing diverse API gateways. And that's been a tricky gap in the market. I will just say that. Okay. The other thing, I'm talking. One of the things that we get questions about, and Christian's going to talk about this. But I'm not going to be an expert on this, but it's in his slides. I know he's got it. But part of the thing is a lot of people think that containers and microservices are stateless. And we all know, well, you guys are not using step functions, so you must not know that. That state can handle and manage applications in a pretty decent way. So there's a room for state, and there's a room for stateless. And there's a growing recognition. So the issue is that the trend is to basically start thinking through the assets that are available to you to manage state. Like one example that I'm talking to customers about is where like using queuing to queue for supporting reliability, so that the microservices are front-ended with queuing software that will allow events to pour into that and then organize into the APIs. That's one thing. The other one is just using orchestration tools or workflow or step function to keep control of the total amount of the total work that needs to get done as it executes through different microservices and make it reliable. And in some cases, make it a little bit more transactional where it's needed. So that's a big topic that has to be sort of figured out when you start on your journey of doing microservices. So then let me ask, how many of you are doing microservices development? How many of you are managing state embedded in the microservice or separate, embedded in the microservice? How many have separated it out? So yeah, state can be a really big issue for for bigger systems moving in, especially multi-step, when there's a multi-step use case. So anyway, so now let's go to containers, because I kept these two together, IaaS and private paths, because those have shifted heavily to containers. And so we'll treat that separate or as a group, because what some people are doing is they're staging to cloud, or they're moving to cloud in stages. So there are different ways that you can do that. The way that I spend more time talking to clients about is that their stuff is they're either retiring what they have or they're extending what they have. And so they're adopting new software and they're re-platforming or re-architecting how they're approaching integration and connectivity, and how they're building custom solutions on that. And so what they do is they use the new software, make it run inside the data center on a container, which is, provides cloud architecture for them in the container. And then they take that, and once it's all running, and they're also able to move the data assets to the cloud, they lift that and move it into the cloud. So lift and shift. So and so from that perspective, you're in private paths, and then you deploy and you host it on infrastructure as a service, and it sort of gives you this way to have cloud and also cloud choices. And in some cases, customers are not quite sure which cloud they want to use, so they have these big religious wars inside their organizations about which cloud they want to move that load to. And so the development teams don't want to wait until that decision is made, because it sometimes can take a long time. And so they start building this way, and then they figure out they can late stage it once that decision is made, because the containers are getting to be standardized enough to be able to do that. Okay, so drivers, why are people picking containers? We did a survey, IDC did a survey in January this year, and so I thought I would take the results from the survey. I'm not gonna go through all of them, that would be mean to do, but you can, you can get a copy of the slide. But security is the top reason, for doing that, and then also to increase developer productivity, because it supports DevOps pretty well, and there's a lot of automation that you can apply because you're on a container. And they're also using it as a mechanism for modernization. So those are, I'm gonna just give you the top three. And then there's a lot of others. What I think is really interesting is that when I get involved with projects where I'm doing the business planning side of containers, I focus a lot on what happens to costs and efficiency types of topics. That didn't even make its way onto any top reasons. And so the other trend I want to talk about is this idea that we're progressing on a path to cost-efficient computing now, through a couple different mechanisms. So when you look at the way that software is sold, especially middleware, it tends to be sold either by CPUs and vCPUs, so you're paying for capacity and it's set to high watermark. So you pay for the moment of the year that you do the most work, and that's what you build capacity for, plus excess. And then what happens is that you end up, like a project I worked on had when you look at it from a utilization perspective, they were utilizing their assets. It was for an integration project. They were at, I think it was 24% average utilization. And the rest of the time, so they were paying as if they were always at peak. And so when you think about cloud, part of the reason people like cloud was that all of a sudden you paid for what you used. It was pay as pay for utility. And so that's now starting to shift. And so containers right now run software that still has a traditional pricing model to it. But it's shifting, and next year we're going to see choices where you can buy software that does have pay-as-you-go pricing. And so this year there was nothing about cost efficiencies. Next year and the year after, I think that we're going to see that as one of the major benefits of doing cloud computing, because if you are only at 34% average utilization, and suddenly you can apply that to capacity to only pay for what you need, then it changes the cost dynamics of running in a container, even in your data center as well as in the cloud. And the other thing is most people are really interested in serverless because it is very efficient. You pay for units, you pay for each call in units of 6 minutes of time or 5 minutes of time. That's pretty efficient. And so the other thing that's happening is there are some organizations that are working on by the second pricing for containers, for middleware running in containers. So over the next couple of years, a lot of the decision making is going to be based on security, developer productivity, but the ROI that you take the CFO to get the benefit of moving to containers more aggressively will be around cost efficiency. So, and people argue with me about that too. So I haven't proved it yet except for projects that I have worked on, but I will, but I finally have to start publishing about it. Okay, so the next thing is going into this topic of sprawl, right? We talked about API gateway sprawl, but in general, everything is very sprawly. When you're in a cloud, when you're successfully running a workload in cloud, it typically starts in a SaaS application. If that works, then another SaaS application is adopted, and a third and a fourth. And then you say, oh, I'm going to build custom stuff, and then you're into a whole different set of clouds, and you're into something like AWS, or you're on Azure, or Google, or IBM. And so next thing you know, you are trying to create interoperability across all this sprawl. And so when you think about how we used to deal with integration, 10 years ago, it was basically in the data center. And then there were some things that were outside the data center, but most of the work was inside. And now everything is outside. And so, the pressure to be able to make all this stuff perform well is really on. And it's causing a lot of adoption of new technology, especially in the integration space, to extend out capabilities to be able to deal with sprawl. And it's also creating the need to re-platform. So there's major re-platforming as well as extensions because of this decentralization that's going on. So what do you do about it, right? So I said people buy new software, and or they extend it. And so typically when you look at integration, where you're trying to do really important stuff with the integration, and it needs to be able to run across a decentralized architecture, then you're really, API management is going to be one of your best friends. So I don't talk to very many organizations that don't consider that as a must-have for these sorts of replatforming efforts. And then you also have, core integration. So, to support a diversity of patterns. So it's not necessarily that you are putting a central ESB to run across everything. You're basically either localizing or using integration to either embed into your microservices, or you're using it to build what are the equivalent of standalone utility services that handle all of a particular style of or pattern of integration. So it's instead of like the central model, it becomes decentralized and optimized for the type of integration that needs to be performed for that service. And the other thing is that secure gateway is critical, and messaging is becoming way more important for everything. For both reliability guarantees and as well, just because the whole world is moving toward loosely coupled, asynchronous, event-driven, and so most of these systems have to have really, really good and often fault-tolerant messaging that goes with that. And so what ends up happening is that you end up with a stack to handle integration that looks something like, it's not a technical view, but it's kind of the kind of craziness that you have to sort of think through. And so you have to support all these different types. And you're also thinking about how you're going to be building these sort of hybrid integration services, managing state and stateless, all that. You have all these different assets that are consumers. Big data, SaaS applications, there's a sprawl of consumers. And then you have also a diversity of roles that are involved. It's not just a developer or an integration specialist who's doing, integration. It's not just a developer who's doing building custom applications. Data scientists have a bigger and bigger role in how things are getting built now. So they have a place in this. And they have a place on the ingest side as well as on how they're going to deploy what they built, because they need data. And so that's also creating a big change in how things are handled. There are semi-pro developers, which are like a business analyst, someone who might be able to design a process, but they're going from just designing it to actually getting it into production. And then we have end users. So there's a big trend now to make sure to seed ground and say, look, we need to have a system that's safe, secure, and reliable, but we don't have to control every single thing that needs to be integrated or automated. So if we can, enterprises are looking for easy to use capabilities that let end users sort of build and configure off of APIs and software that's usable for them. And so a lot of predictions are being made about how, integration and automation, end users are going to dominate. There'll be more integration and automation happening from end users or teams than there are from developers, just because there's so much need for it in the market, and the resources could never, making the software easier to use on top of something trustworthy is going to produce the highest productivity. So that's a big trend. You probably start looking at that a little bit more. So 3 recommendations. One is if you're doing, if you're trying to build competency because you think you want to get out ahead of what your organization is going to do, try to make sure that your project, you have a proof of concept and some skills for containers. So that would be number 1, top recommendation. And the second one is, if things are sprawly, then the existing integration is not going to cut it, right? And so begin to assess what your gaps are and what your capabilities are. You don't have to throw away things that work really well, but you're probably going to need to do some extension of that and to basically support some of this. And the third one is that, a lot of times development, there's a tendency to treat that as, I have a project, I'm going to get it into production, I'm going to do my next project, I'm going to get it into production. But when you look at APIs and services, those are products inside your organization. And so thinking about a project rather than product, think more product than project, and do product management of your services and APIs, because it's going to make a difference in terms of adoption and success. Like some of the things that I've seen are organizations that have really, really great documentation for their APIs, and they publicize the documentation through a variety of mechanisms, have much more significant adoption than those who don't. And the measure of that is that they're being adopted by other developers. So, so document, treat them like products, make sure everyone knows that they're available, and stick with it. Don't just move to the next project. So those are my recommendations. Does anyone have any questions about anything that we went through on this?
Okay, we got questions. Put your hand up, I'll bring the microphone to you.
Or shout and I'll repeat, whatever you're comfortable with.
I'll do one. So you mentioned that there's just a strong trend from being in one cloud to being in multiple clouds. What are typically the arguments that people make there to actually justify that investment? Because you're having to train people in multiple locations, and so what is the reason that drives people there?
So, well, first off, for the trends are different for application clouds versus bespoke clouds. Bespoke is where you build custom apps, and so the decision is made about which cloud to use based on the capabilities that the business needs to solve a problem. And so if you need Salesforce for Salesforce automation, and you need Marketo for marketing, or Eloqua, whatever, then those are on different clouds. If you're doing finance, you're using yet another option. So the business processes that you're trying to re-platform or automate are going to drive the decision. So that creates application cloud sprawl and drives huge investments, huge growth, by the way, because I look at how much spending is going on, huge growth in the adoption of cloud integration, or iPaaS as a category. So when you're doing bespoke, sometimes I would say there's a combination of internal debate. Sometimes there's one pattern that says if you're really good with .NET and you are a Microsoft shop, you're going to do Azure, and if you're really good with Java, you're going to do AWS, and the numbers sort of prove that out. But when you're in an organization that's got a Microsoft-oriented development team and a Java-oriented development team, they're both going to pick the most hospitable environment, Amazon for Java and .NET. The same thing when you look at commercial cloud software, vendors that offer Java-based solutions always deploy they always are in the AWS marketplace, or their AMI is on AWS, or they're available on AWS because it's Java. And if you are a member of the Microsoft partner ecosystem, you're going to be deploying on Azure. So that means that it creates a sprawl. The other thing is you get interesting things where internally they're debating. So then they say, we're using Office 365, and they're going to give us a really good discount if we go to Azure. And then the development team that builds all these back-end systems on Java, they're going, what? How does that work for us? And so then they have to go through the logic of why it makes sense to do Java to Java, and not because you're going to get a discount on Office 365. So there's a lot of confusion and different people debating, and sometimes it becomes a logical decision, and that logical decision results in the sprawl, and other times it's just experimenting with what you know best that creates the sprawl.
Okay. We have a question back here, Maureen. I'll hand you the mic.
I have a question in regards to one of the slides I actually saw was the trend for containers. I was more interested, and you actually kind of mentioned about Lambda services as well with AWS. So what are the trends in terms of adoption of, say, stateless architecture versus containers for the next 5 to 6 years?
Stateless versus container. So they're serverless or stateless?
Serverless.
Yeah,
serverless.
That is a huge topic. That's actually a great question, a huge topic. Strong opinions. It's very opinionated. So the serverless people, and there are analysts who are serverless people too, right? They're saying, within 5 years, then serverless is going to be the dominant environment for building solutions. And so from that perspective, they're right. Serverless is not just going to be functions. There's all sorts of things that are coming out in a serverless style. So if you're on AWS, you'll likely in a couple of years be doing some major work with serverless using Lambda and then step functions and some other things that they're building. But you're then locked into AWS, right? And so in a way, serverless has been a boon for the cloud platforms in the face of container because it's innovative and it's very cost oriented, cost efficient oriented, and it gets people very interested in being able to use that, and it's very simplified use of that for a good cost and good performance. So that's going to be important. Containers can run, so it seems weird, but a large container could run a serverless infrastructure. A lot of it is about the business model associated with capacity and offering capacity. But the other thing is that when enterprises look at containers, they're saying, oh wow, I've got portability. I can actually build something and deploy it in a lot of different places, and I need that. So a good example would be, I had a discussion with a European company that their organization moved to Oracle HCM from PeopleSoft. They had 600 endpoints communicating with PeopleSoft. 600. It's like, that was my biggest, connectivity problem. And they were basically doing data sync, but it was FTP, not even SFTP, so insecure data sync, using unreliable FTP to keep everything up to date. So then they said, oh, that's not going to work. Oddly enough, that won't work with cloud. And so for them, they had to make decisions about where they're going to locate some of these applications because there's a benefit in speed and performance for the co-location as well as security, and where they could and what they do about the others. And so there's a big reinvestment that goes in around the connectivity framework and integration. But there was also the problem of portability of choice to be able to figure out how to make these complex systems perform really well. Serverless is not going to solve that problem. Containers solve that problem. And so from that perspective, the way that I look at it is that they're both going to be really important next generation design patterns or compute patterns. And they'll be, in some cases, function as a service will appear in a container. And containers will always be portable, except for container as a service, which is linked directly to an individual cloud. And both will exist. What I'm unwilling to predict yet is the size difference between the two in terms of total spending. I think containers, because the management issue hasn't been dealt with yet. Like how do you manage containers that are deployed everywhere as if it's a unit of one? So once that's figured out, we'll be able to predict, or how well that's done is how we can predict whether containers will dominate or serverless. I'm spending more time on containers because it's more interesting to me because it's, I think, maybe less known. I don't know. Does that answer? Okay.
We have a question at the front here. The gentleman.
Hello. Hi. I have a couple questions. If they're going to be getting to it in the remainder of the day, you can defer the questions to later.
Okay.
Couple things about, so you mentioned that security is one of the top concerns, and that's why people are going towards containers. I'm not from security, but at the same time, most of what I've seen is that they put a lot of controls right at the starting, and that's how they control to make sure that a person does not go against their wishes, their guidelines. So a container that can move around wherever it wants, and they can't keep track of it, how is that better, or why do they like it better?
The whole thing about it is keeping track of it, right? So I will say, what I'm going to do is defer that to Christian when you speak, because I'm not going to say I'm a security expert.
Okay.
I'm saying they pick security. I've done work looking at some elements of security, but that ain't my domain. So I'm not going to
Okay.
pretend I know something.
Another question was,
Oh, we could take the question on a panel.
okay.
You're up, but you have to answer it, so it doesn't matter.
So you also mentioned middleware layers coming in, and also products that might eventually be turning into more containers or PaaS solutions, et cetera, that could be deployed. What about the big players like WebLogic and Oracle and all these guys? Do you see them going down that route? Will I ever get to the point where they will do pay by the hour? Because it seems
That's a wonderful
how
question.
they will make money.
I love and actually I can answer that question. It's
Perfect.
opinionated, but So the different vendors have different approaches for how they're going to market, what their strategy is. So if you think about Oracle, right? They're going to market by having a sort of like a captive environment called Oracle Cloud. They're containerizing it, but they're not really thinking about portability of the container. And so they're trying really, really hard to have customers make the decision to move any sort of new workload into Oracle in some way. And so from that perspective, I've had issues in working with clients and Oracle to try to, deal with some of the topics that allow Oracle products to run efficiently on something like AWS, but they really don't want to do that. So for me, if you're not on Oracle Cloud, Oracle is no longer a strategic middleware provider, period.
So would that be if I deploy that in my own private instance of Oracle Cloud? Or is it still I have to go
Yeah,
to them?
private, I mean, they have these cloud machines, they want you to do that. So
Okay.
they want to, the cloud, Oracle, red in any form, they want you to do. So, and they're optimizing for that. But if you need red, green, and blue, then you probably need something else, to
So-
be blunt.
Last question. So this is kind of the industry trends of where things are going. You mentioned containers. You mentioned people are going towards it so that they can move around and go to move from cloud to cloud based on because those decisions might happen later. Do you see potential future at the point where you have some additional middleware in between that figures out which is the cheapest place to currently put this kind of thing and move it around like high frequency trading?
I think that's, so I
how
think that's
far
a
that
great
would be.
question, right? And I will say no, they don't have it yet. Will they have it? I think so. It would be an interesting, so I
Let's make
remember a year ago when I started looking at middleware running on containers, and I was giving the vendors a hard time about why are you not just changing your pricing models? And just change your pricing model to utility-based on your container. And I felt like it's a reasonable thing to nag vendors about. I mean, how many of you think that's reasonable to nag them about, right?
Very reasonable.
Right. So then I went through, I went and started figuring out why they're just not doing it. Why is that so hard? And so there's a lot of work that has to go on in the container to build metering systems. And so point number one, when you're looking at container platforms, then, and you're going to run commercial software in that container, then only pick vendors that have a roadmap of metering, right? And by the way, there's only one vendor,
Which one?
Red Hat. So there you go. And but the other thing is pricing doesn't change until the mechanisms are in place to actually change pricing. Otherwise, each vendor has to build their own pricing model themselves in order to do metering plus billing. And so I think that's why I said 2019 and 2020 are going to be big years for middleware utilities. And so vendors that you look at, so container platforms, you have to look at it from that perspective of metering because you want to have this a cost issue as quickly as you can, cost efficiency issue. And the second thing is middleware products. You have to ask them what they're doing about utility pricing. And if they just say, oh, we're going to let you subscribe to APIs by the number of calls a month, that's not good enough. So it's a big topic.
OpenStack has Ciliometer as part of the project.
What?
OpenStack has, I think it's called Ciliometer, where it does and keeps track of everything. So is that something that's going to show up in containers as well?
I don't know.
Okay.
That's at that level that I try not to know that much about.
I don't know either. That's what I'm asking you. Thanks.
You can answer at the panel. Maybe you can take that at the panel discussion.
Yeah, oh
later on
yeah,
this
good.
morning.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we got time for one more quick question. We got about 3 minutes. Does anybody out there still have a question that I didn't see? No? You're reserving them for the panel discussion?
Oh wait, ask if anyone disagrees with me violently on any topic.
Yes. Well, you've already asked, so I will not ask again.
All right. You're going to tell me that you're from Oracle, right?
I wasn't going to go with
and
the
you're
disagree,
going to sue
but
me.
I'm not going to go with the disagree, but it prompted a thought. You at the beginning you showed some stats, and it was worldwide. And I think adoption of cloud is behind in Canada, and I'm wondering what for public sector from BC Hydro. I'm wondering what would drive, or what gaps, like what could government do to improve adoption, the ease of adoption for cloud, based on trends you've seen for other governments going to cloud first?
Right. So, one of the things that I've seen are, for us in the U.S., some of the federal initiatives are driven by congressional mandates. It's really great. It's shocking that they actually know enough about tech to mandate something, but they are sort of mandating both zero cot, all cots and all cloud, and so that's got a lot of it's creating some urgency inside some of the agencies to start dealing with that, and I think the other piece is it depends if it's federal or local, but there's adoption of application, like if you need to build know your customer or know your citizen types of applications, those tend to lend themselves really well to cloud because they're externally focused. And if they're externally focused, then why wouldn't you just put it in the cloud? So those can be smaller projects that get departmental, budget because citizens want to do business online. So there's pressure to do business online, and that moves you to cloud that way as well. So, and that actually goes all the way down to, city governments and up through larger groups. So those would be the big things. But even with that, I'm seeing like really private organizations moving to cloud, agencies moving to cloud. So they feel like it's becoming safe enough where they can be on a gov cloud and not worry about breaches as much as they would for what they're running themselves. So, you just have to look and see what legislation is going on and what initiatives are going on because of meeting citizen demand, right? At least from what I can see. Are you seeing anything different from that?
You mentioned GovCloud. So what brought GovCloud? Was there a certain investment level required for that to happen? Like cloud, like sovereign cloud infrastructure is quite new. I believe in the US there is like GovCloud, which would make it sort of easy to say cloud first, go in there, have GovCloud.
Right. So what's happening is that at least, so I can only, I'm not an expert in getting questions from Canadian governments about moving to cloud, so I'm not saying I am. I've had to learn some of the U.S. federal things, but one thing about like GovCloud is that there are all sorts of certifications that have to be in place to be compliant with, with the agencies have to be compliant with those regulations, and they're all around security. And then all the different vendors that offer commercial software also have to be really good on security, that are offering it natively on like Amazon GovCloud or Microsoft Azure, whatever they're called. The thing that's really interesting, there's a side note on that, which is that if you are in a container, I'm going to go back to container again, right? So if you're replatforming onto a container that eventually will run into GovCloud, you don't have to use any software that has that certification. You just are responsible for running that certification, and it's easier for agencies to get certified than it is for vendors. So there's some momentum happening around containers just because it's the fastest path to deployment because of, because a lot of the vendors on the bespoke side are not certified to run on GovCloud directly. So that's an interesting, I don't know what the Canadian rules are, but I would bet that if there's certifications, it's going to be about security and so that's the big thing. Exactly. Yep. Okay, we're up. Thank you.